Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to discuss with you some of the basic principles of the field of statistics. That's right, I'm going to go over a couple of the basics of statistics and sort of maybe more importantly than that, um, explain, in my opinion, the rationale why statistics might be important for you to consider uh, during your beginning stages of science. And so let's get into that conversation. And so, one of the things that I want to draw your attention to before we get into statistics is just simply this Bloom's, maybe you're familiar with it, this Bloom's taxonomy pyramid of cognitive thinking. And so, this is very important as it applies to education. In terms of, teachers need to consider these kinds of thinking levels. Do you notice here as a pyramid, it's sort of crescendoing or building into like the highest order of thinking? And so down here, it's when you're discussing material in a class or a video, one of the basic principles is that you hope the student, and maybe you can relate to this, or watching a video, you can hope that you're remembering it. Can the student recall the information being presented? In other words, can you define things? Can you memorize things? Can you reproduce it, restate it? These are sort of the fundamentals. And again, one could argue, though it's on the bottom level, it might be most important to be able to recall information before you could start really like thinking about it on a higher level. And then understanding it. Like, in other words, can the student really explain the ideas being discussed? And can you identify and recognize things from a list, be able to translate it, that sort of thing. And then going a little bit higher is, the question is, can you apply it, the information, the data in a new way? In other words, can you employ it? Can you write about it? Can you solve things? Analyzing, in other words, can you distinguish between the different parts? Comparing and contrasting is an example of analyzing. Criticizing, examining, experimenting, these kinds of things. And then getting very high up on this taxonomy is students, are they able to justify a stance or justify a decision? In other words, can they evaluate the data being presented or the information? Can they appraise it? Can they argue? Can they defend it and make judgment about it, support it? And then finally, creativity. Can a student actually create a new product or their own personal point of view based on the things that they've learned? And so this is a pyramid of learning, if you will. And so why are we discussing this if this is an introduction to statistics conversation? Is because I think in terms of quantitative reasoning, which is our most important types of thinking in science, we have this of our own pyramid in science, and it's sort of based a little bit on these same principles of Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive development. These are the ones right here where we start off in science by simply, we have questions about things, and we simply go about by observing, and we make observations, we count things, we measure things, and this is how we input data. This is how we collect things. And so we have to have that. And so that's most important. And then, this is an overwhelming amount of material sometimes. Data can get large. And so we find ways in which, as we're moving up, we find ways that we can put it into tables, organize it, and then pictorially graph it, order it, sequence it. And then again, we start to problem solve and then analyze the material and develop different alternative hypotheses and change our directions. And then ultimately, we might even create a model for which new data could be interpreted, and we can make predictions about things that we haven't even been around to test. In other words, predictability through modeling is sort of the highest level of quantitative reasoning. Now, getting into this in terms of like counting and measuring and calculating, I thought I'd give you some examples of this so you really would know what we're talking about. So sometimes in class, you might be familiar with, if you're growing bacteria or some sort of a microorganism on a petri dish, it might be simply just counting the colonies. Or if you're working with fruit flies, it might be looking at a particular set of traits and actually counting the number of fruit flies, for example, that have a particular eye color. Or you might be counting rings on a slide of a tree. Or you might be counting hairs on the petiole of a plant, or the number of stomata on the lower epidermis of a leaf, or measuring the area of a leaf. And so, these things seem like they're simple, but they can get kind of difficult. In other words, like when you're trying to count populations of things, and that's what I want to get into this conversation. Populations can be really huge. They're really massive, the number of red blood cells in your body. Now, like, how can you possibly do this? And so what we end up doing is taking a sample, which is a small subset of the population. We still have to count it, or in other words, the number of leaves on a tree. Again, we could sample that and then extrapolate in terms of the total number of leaves that are found on a tree. And so this sometimes involves sampling. You could do mark recapture or employ some kind of quadrant and make an estimate. And so that's why where we're going to get into this conversation about population. Now, population size is n, so that variable n, the number of in the sample size. And so, as I mentioned, it's usually kind of huge. And so it's almost impossible to ever study it. And so it's more appropriate and it's more practical for a scientist like yourself to take a sample of the population. And you're like, well, I want to do the whole thing. You can't do the whole thing. You have to take a sample. So the thing is, the question we always have about this is the sample that we're taking of the population, is it legitimate? Is it really reflecting? Does it contain the characteristics of the total population? This is what we want to know. And we can't make that sort of flippantly. We can't say, well, I think it does. I hope it does. It might. No, we want to take things a little bit more quantitative. And so the characteristics of a population are called the parameters. Okay, so with the statistics that we're about to study is the study of those parameters. In other words, like, is the data, can we analyze the data? Is it appropriate? Does it reflect the population? These kinds of things to help us answer questions. And so, very simply, here's a small data sample right here. Some numbers. Okay, so here they are. And so, the sample size. And so, again, why do we use a sample? Like, all numbers too difficult to analyze. So we take a sample and it helps us make predictions about the larger population. And so the sample size is simply, and let me start to analyze. The sample size is the number of observations. So you simply go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so sample size is 7. Okay? So as simple as that, the sample size, although very important. Now, a comment about this. Sample size, you want to do as large of a sample size as possible, okay? So that it's more predictive of the larger population. So sample size, again, it's appropriate to whatever experiment you're doing, but the larger the sample size, the better, okay? So you always want to consider large sample sizes. Another thing that we want to consider when we're analyzing data is the mean. Now, the mean is also the same thing as the average, and you might be familiar with this. It's an X with a bar over it. And so the average, to calculate the average of data, you simply add the total of all of the data. So in other words, 2, 6, 3, 2, 5, 9, and 8, if you were to add that, it comes up to 35. And so it's the sum of all the data, then divided by the total number in the sample, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7. So 35 divided by 7 is 5. So the mean of this data set right here is 5. Okay? So that's the average. Now the median is something different. The median is the midpoint of all the data. And so if you want to determine the median, what you need to do is first take your data points and you need to put them in order. And so I did that for you. So you put the 2, the 3, the 5, the 6, the 8, and 9. And so to find that, you simply say like that, you work it out and you go, okay, what's the middle of this? So I'm crossing off the n ones like that. And do you notice how the middle right here, the medium is 5? So the medium in this case is 5. And that's how you would solve that. Now, what happens if there's an uneven number like this? Let me sort of try to complicate matters. Let me make that into a 13 like this. And so now, what are we going to do? So if you cross off the 2, the 13, the 2, the 9, the 3, the 8, and you're like, uh-oh, what am I going to do here? So what you want to do, if there's 2 points remaining here and you're trying to determine the median, what you're going to do is take the average between 5 and 6. And so the median, or capital M, would be 5.5. And that's how that would work. So that should be pretty straightforward. Now, there's something called the range. Now, the range, by definition, is the difference between the extremities of the data. And so, in other words, you want to maybe line them up, and you say the highest point right here is 9. And so it's 9, and the lowest value would be 2. So the difference is subtraction. So it's 9 minus 2 is 7. Okay. So again, if I were going to continue with this and say, well, 13, if I added that to it, I'd say, well, this would therefore be the highest number. So 2 taken away from 13, it would be 11. So that's the range of the data. Now the mode is the value that occurs most frequently in the data set. And so I took a different data set so you can see this. So first thing you want to do is, if it's a large data set, you want to put it into order. So when you order the numbers, they look like this. And again, it's easy to see this. And so I chose this image. You can see how the number 23 occurs most often. So in this case, the mode is 23. And then again, over here, you look at another example. 19 occurs more frequently, and so 19 is the mode. Okay, so in terms of this quantitative reasoning, I've been emphasizing the counting, the measuring, and calculating. But really what we want to do is we want to get into these higher order things. We want to get into problem solving and analytics and come up to alternative hypothesis, and then again a model that is very predictive. And so why do we want to do that? And what do we do once we've collected the data? Why do we want to organize it? Why do we want to analyze it, interpret it? Because we ultimately want to present it. Obviously, we're doing a study in science because it's valuable, because it's not only interesting to us, but it might be important for saving the environment in some way, or it might be some kind of medicine, a pharmaceutical. It's something that we want to communicate. So it really comes down to communication. And we also want to give validity to the data as well, and sort of in order to make our point, to make sure that our data is something that is again reasonable. And so again, just a little conversation about why it's important. And so again, we want to be able to effectively conduct research, so that's why we need to learn our statistics. And again, it'd be difficult to make decisions based on this data if we didn't apply statistical analysis to it. And so we want to know whether or not the research is reasonable, whether we want to continue with the project or not. And so you might be wondering, well, maybe I'm not going to be doing any research. Maybe I'll never need to know this. Well, you already know this, that there's many claims that come into your life, or commercials are a prime example of this. Usually statistics can be manipulated, or they could be misunderstood if you don't understand them clearly. And so that's another reason why we should really pay attention to statistics. And so certainly if you decide to continue on in your education, in other words, if you want to get a master's degree or a doctoral degree, obviously you're going to need to conduct research, and you're going to need to apply statistics to that in order to react to the data that you're collecting intelligently. And you're also going to be needing to read a lot of papers and analyzing the literature to make sure that the research that you're studying is legitimate. And so that it's very helpful. And so I just wanted to say it's one of the most important things that we could really study. And so I hope you enjoyed this introduction to statistics. Thanks for watching.